policy in the UK. My name is Anthony Moreno, and I work on policy here at ALI. As I'm sure some of you know, the UK is currently in the process of revising its regulatory framework for animal welfare, and we have two panelists whose organizations have been involved in progressing aquatic animal welfare through policy advocacy in the UK. Compared to welfare for terrestrial animals, fish welfare has historically not been considered in animal welfare policy considerations. So I'm very excited to hear about the work that's being done to address this policy gap. But just a few quick housekeeping reminders for our attendees before we get started. This session will last approximately 50 minutes, and we will open up time at the end for Q&A. As with all of our panels, all attendees in this session are muted with cameras off. Also, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box or chat below. Or if you're on the Whova app, feel free to post questions there. This session is also being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. And lastly, we expect respectful and productive discussions and have a zero tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination of any kind. With that said, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists for this session, Claire Howard and Amro Hussain. Claire is co-director of Crustacean Compassion and has been campaigning for the legal protection and humane treatment of decapod crustaceans since it was founded in 2016. Amro is a human rights activist and is senior public affairs lead for the Humane League UK. So a big welcome to our panelists. And that's it for me for now. Claire, would you like to go ahead and get started for us?
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Anthony. I'll just try sharing my screen and hopefully this will go seamlessly. Okay, can you see that all okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Excellent, thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Claire Howard, as Anthony just said. I'm the Executive Director at Crustacean Compassion. Thank you all for joining the session today. It's great to be back for the second Aquatic Life Conference and to see the wide variety of topics being covered. It's especially heartening to hear presentations involving the many different types of aquatic animals. In this presentation, I'm going to outline how Crustacean Compassion have been working in the UK to include decapod crustaceans, which are animals such as crabs, lobsters, nephrops, into animal welfare law. To begin, I'll briefly introduce us as an organisation before telling you a little about some of the key welfare problems faced by decapod crustaceans in the food industry. I'll then discuss what we've been working on in the UK and how we've adapted our campaign to take advantage of the changing policy frameworks following Brexit. Finally, we'll hopefully have an opportunity to discuss how some of the lessons learnt with our campaign could be applied in other contexts. Firstly, a little about Crustacean Compassion. We formed as a volunteer organisation in 2016 and launched our campaign to achieve humane treatment of decapod crustaceans. At that time, this was a neglected issue, and the more we investigated, the more we realised that the welfare of these animals was not being considered at a policy level. Furthermore, there didn't appear to be anyone working to change this. It seemed the general feeling was this wasn't an issue of particular priority. Although substantial evidence existed showing that these animals could feel pain, there were no legal protections for them, meaning that they could be treated in horrific ways that would not be considered acceptable for other species. When this is further considered in the context of the number of animals involved, we knew it had to change. And over the past 5 years, Crustacean Compassion has worked to bring together the knowledge and experience of scientists, campaigners, lawyers, and industry to elevate a forgotten group of animals to one that makes headline news and is discussed at the top levels of government. We're now an established non-profit company with a team of employed staff and a remit to ensure that this progress delivers real-world improvements for the welfare of these animals. So what's the problem? I could talk for hours about the significant welfare issues faced by decapod crustaceans on their journey from sea to plate or within the emerging aquaculture sector, but that's not the focus of this talk. And in part, that makes me quite happy to see that we're starting to move on from the presentation we gave last year, for example, where we were introducing the evidence of their sentience. And we're now progressing to seeing how this is being reflected in policy change. Instead, I'll give a quick whistle-stop tour of the main issues involved in the sea to plate journey, as this will be a significant focus for future policy work in this area. As with other aquatic animals, the main areas where welfare concerns are found include capture, transport, storage, holding, mutilations, and slaughter. There are also humane alternatives and recommendations that could be made to reduce the unnecessary suffering that these animals endure. We'll very briefly take a little look at some of these in a bit more detail. So decapod crustaceans destined to the food production are either wild caught or harvested on farms, and there are a variety of methods used depending on factors including species, scale, local traditions. The many often severe challenges faced by decapods during capture or harvesting and subsequent processing are the cause of very significant welfare issues. The extent of welfare compromise experienced during capture is significantly affected by the methods used, some of which are listed on this slide. The effects of capture are suffered both at the time and in the longer term, and have an impact on the welfare and survival during onward travel and storage. Crustacean compassion wants to see the least harmful methods of capture and post-capture handling and holding applied for each species, an approach that would benefit both commercially and, most importantly, the animals involved. Equipment and practices that reduce levels and impact of bycatch on non-target decapod crustacean and other species should also be used. More issues arrive during transport. Each year, millions of live decapod crustaceans are transported within and beyond the borders for commercial purposes, during which they are subjected to journeys of widely differing environmental conditions and duration, some lasting several days. Common transport practices, including the loading and unloading processes, expose decapods to multiple stresses, including but not limited to those listed here. Confinement in close proximity to others of the same or sometimes different species pose additional welfare challenges, such as fighting and cannibalism, as they're often solitary or rarely mix in their natural habitats. As a result, the animals experience many physical, physiological, immunological, and behavioral disturbances. This inevitably causes suffering and results in high levels of morbidity and mortality, both in transit and during recovery at destination. Unfortunately, shorter journeys are not necessarily better though. A major concern is home delivery of live decapods, for example, through Amazon. What's more, if they do actually make it to their location in a suitable condition for consumption, then they're in the sole care of the customer, who is most likely unaware of how to appropriately store and humanely slaughter them. We believe that the occurrence, frequency, and duration of transportation of live decapods must be minimized. Traveling conditions must be adapted to the species to optimize welfare, and approaches that replace live transport to carcass-only trade developed and implemented. Many of the welfare concerns that occur during storage overlap with capture and transport, so have already been mentioned. Huge numbers of decapod crustaceans are subjected to some form of holding or another at various stages from the time they're captured in the wild or on farms until they're killed. This includes during pre- and post-transport periods and transition prior to killing and processing, or while on live display in retail outlets, restaurants, and live markets. The duration of storage can sometimes vary, sometimes being for several months. The conditions and associated welfare challenges are also hugely variable. There are better conditions in which to keep decapods, but unfortunately these are rarely met. These conditions relate to water quality, temperature, lighting, stocking density, and whether there's shelter. Decapods are solitary animals that prefer dark and sheltered areas, but despite this, they're often found in overcrowded, brightly lit tanks, or worse, kept on ice, sometimes while shrimp wrapped in plastic. The practice of mixing different species during storage is a key source of stress and should also be avoided at all times. Evidence clearly indicates that the risks to welfare increase with duration of holding, especially in the absence of feeding. Therefore, storage of these animals should be kept to a minimum, along with optimizing the conditions in which the animals are exposed. There are also several types of mutilations that are applied to decapod crustaceans in the food industry. Eye stalk ablation of prawns and shrimp is a widespread practice involving removing both eye stalk of the breeding female shrimp or prawns, often without any anesthetic. Declawing of crabs is the manual removal of one or both claws from them. It is carried out both in fisheries and at sea. Claw nicking involves fracturing the exoskeleton and cutting the tendons in the claws, resulting in an open wound with heightened susceptibility to infection and other negative effects. All of these are unacceptable and should be prohibitive. There are better alternatives available. As was touched on yesterday, during yesterday's talk on slaughter, the most obvious cause of cruel treatment is inhumane slaughter methods. Decapod crustaceans are not protected by slaughter regulations, and there are few guidelines on humane slaughter available. Therefore, they are routinely subjected to unnecessary suffering due to inhumane methods, which would be considered completely unacceptable in a vertebrate animal. Common killing methods include live boiling, chilling in the freezer before live boiling, freshwater drowning, and live carving. Many of the current methods used to prepare decapods for consumption in an attempt to be kinder are actually ineffective and inhumane. Studies have found that an edible crab takes approximately 30 to 40 minutes to lose consciousness in the freezer and may take up to 3 minutes to lose consciousness in boiling water, and this time may actually increase if they have been frozen to begin with. Effective humane stunning must take place prior to slaughter of decapods. They should only be slaughtered using methods that result in either instantaneous, within 1 second death, or instantaneous insensibility to pain and distress until death occurs. As mentioned before, there are humane alternatives, and where they exist, we believe it's entirely reasonable to say they should be implemented. So now you know some of the welfare issues faced by decapod crustaceans in the food industry. I'll focus on what we've been doing to improve the situation from a policy and legislative perspective in the UK. So the first step for us was to look at existing legislative opportunities. There are 3 UK Animal Welfare Acts, one for Scotland, one for Northern Ireland, and one for England and Wales combined. None of these cover invertebrate animals, but they do have a provision to include them, should sufficient scientific evidence show that they are capable of experiencing pain and suffering. The Animal Welfare Bill, when it was written in 2005, actually debated whether decapod crustaceans should be included, and the Select Committee in fact recommended that they should be over 15 years ago. However, the government decided they were right on the cusp, and the evidence that they could feel pain was still too slim. In the end, they compromised. They inserted a clause into the Act specifically to acknowledge that one day they might have to change their mind. Through a Freedom of Information request, we discovered the government hadn't actually reviewed the depth of science that had come to light on decapod sentience and their ability to feel pain in the 15 or so years since they drafted the bill. So we lobbied for this, hard. We built a case for support to show the consensus this issue had amongst the public, experts, and other animal welfare organisations. As a result, DEFRA commissioned an independent review by the London School of Economics on the evidence of sentience in decapods and cephalopods. Crustacean Compassion submitted over 300 pieces of scientific evidence to this review, but the authors sought input from a wide variety of stakeholders, and the final report went through extensive peer review process. The report has not yet been published. However, ministers have publicly committed to it being published and available by the end of this month. Whilst we're awaiting publication, some of the authors of this DEFRA commissioned report have submitted evidence to the recent Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee in the UK on the question of whether the scope of animal welfare legislation should be limited to vertebrates or expanded. The submission advises the UK government to recognise that there is strong to substantial evidence of sentience widely across decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks. As you can see here, it states that we should protect all decapod crustaceans in very general legislation such as the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill, while also developing enforceable best practice guidance and regulations that are specific to the welfare needs of commercially important species. Which brings us on to our next phase, turning risks into opportunities. So whilst our initial focus was to look at existing animal welfare legislation to see how we could get decapods included within it, this began in 2016. Those of you who are familiar with British and European politics will know that in 2017, the EU referendum took place, which led to Brexit. It became clear over the coming years that this was going to have a substantial impact on the policy and legislative landscape. As with any major change, there were risks and opportunities for our campaign. The most substantial risk was an already marginalised issue would be entirely lost under the vast scope of issues being discussed. However, by the time this happened, the case for change had already been built. Our petition had clearly shown that this was an issue of public interest, with nearly 60,000 signatures asking for legislative protection for these animals. Furthermore, the stories we shared with major news outlets secured significant national media coverage on the treatment of decapods in the UK, which helped to add to the momentum. There was consensus amongst experts. Our open letter in 2018 had 55 signatories, including leading aquatic animal scientists such as Dr. Lynn Snedden, animal welfare science luminaries such as John Webster, Michael Appleby, and Ian Redmond, and leading NGOs and veterinary organisations such as the British Veterinary Association. During this time, we'd also worked with other animal welfare organisations and were able to show that there was consensus on this issue within the animal welfare community, with over 40 organisations supporting our ask for these animals to be protected in legislation. We're not alone in highlighting the importance of this issue. The Humane Slaughter Association have commissioned a 4-year research project into humane slaughter methods for decapods, and other organisations were focusing on this issue too. For example, the British Veterinary Association released a policy which recognised the sentience of decapods, and other animal welfare organisations have begun including it in their existing work too. A coalition of UK animal welfare organisations formed the Better Deal for Animals Coalition to ensure that animal welfare didn't get lost within Brexit policy and legislative opportunities. These organisations agreed to support us in asking for the inclusion of decapod crustaceans in future opportunities. This united front for decapods all helped to show that this was not an issue that was going to go away. The British government had assured its citizens that animal protection wouldn't be rolled back as a result of Brexit. There was public outcry when it became apparent that despite being a nation of animal lovers, the UK would not explicitly legally recognise animals as sentient beings when we left the EU. As such, and to remedy this, the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill was announced in May 2021 as part of a raft of new animal welfare measures. The initial definition of animal within the text of the Sentience Bill was vertebrate, and therefore excluded decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks. At this time, we really needed to see that review. We really wanted the report that we'd been waiting for since January 2021 to be published. In the meanwhile, we continued to work with colleagues in other organisations and meet with policymakers to push for the inclusion in the definition of animal. This led to the amendment of the bill being tabled by a supportive peer, Baroness Sue Hayman, in the House of Lords. I was hoping to be able to deliver this talk today with news of the report publication, the content of it, and to be able to share that all with you, and to also explain what was going to happen next. But unfortunately, I think we're a few weeks too early for that. What I can say, though, is that all these signs indicate a very promising outcome for the inclusion of decapod crustaceans, both the acceptance of their sentience, the recognition of their sentience and the evidence for it, and their inclusion in the Sentience Bill, which would make animal welfare history in the UK. But the findings of this report should not come as a surprise. It's a review of the evidence of their sentience, and we know this evidence is available, persuasive, robust, and compelling. So what next? The UK wouldn't be the first country to protect decapod crustaceans. However, the combination of the report is a powerful tool. As previously, in other countries where they are protected, it's been done on a more ad hoc basis, or it's been related to specific circumstances within this country. However, the combination of the report and then legal recognition of sentience would provide a template and a rationale that could be replicated elsewhere. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you have at the end.
Thanks so much for that, Claire. And I appreciate you bringing to light the welfare issues that can arise in our food system for decapod crustaceans. And I look forward to hearing in the coming weeks, getting some good news about their inclusion in the Animal Sentience Bill. So very much look forward to that. Amro, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Anthony. Yep, I'll just try and share my screen here now. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a privilege to be speaking to you about aquatic animal welfare policy and issues. As we all know, and as Anthony mentioned at the start, this is something that has been hugely neglected. It's also good timing for me to be speaking here today because just last week at the Humane League UK, we launched our first ever campaign on fishes. The campaign objective is to have UK slaughter legislation change to explicitly require that fishes must be stunned before slaughter. So today I'm going to speak about 3 points in relation to this campaign: how we arrived at this campaign ask, what preliminary research we conducted, and our approach to influencing the government for this campaign. Now, why this campaign ask? Current slaughter legislation in England and Scotland explicitly requires stunning for terrestrial farm animals, but not for fishes. The legislation does require that fishes be spared any avoidable suffering, but does not specify how to do this or provide any other details about how they should be handled at the time of killing. This lack of detail and clarity has helped create a situation where fish stunning is neglected and where there is a reliance on industry and market standards for welfare protection. The problem with this is, of course, that industry and market standards are inconsistent. This means that not all fish are afforded the same protection, and that even producers who do implement stunning could be doing it ineffectively. 2, industry standards have limited enforcement mechanisms. As the standards are unenforceable under the law, there are no significant punishments for breaching them. And of course, 3, reliance on industry standards has led to government neglect of fish welfare. At the Humane League UK, we submitted freedom of information requests to the Scottish and English governments, which revealed that there does not appear to be any regular government welfare inspections at fish processing sites. And neither government could say what percentage of fishes were being stunned, despite the legal requirement to ensure that fish are spared avoidable pain and suffering. Now, we estimate that a high percentage of the industry in England and Scotland are already stunning. There are no official figures because no one is tracking this issue effectively, but we suspect it's around 80 to 90% of industry. However, this still leaves millions of fishes not protected. Also, recently, undercover investigations by Animal Equality and Viva have shown salmon and trout not being stunned properly, being hit over the head several times while still conscious, and experiencing painful deaths. Therefore, without an explicit statement in law requiring fish stunning before slaughter and detailed requirements about how to do this effectively, millions of farmed fishes in the UK are at risk of a painful death each year. Moreover, the lack of detailed slaughter protection law in comparison with other animals implies that they are less deserving of welfare protection. So for that reason alone, it is important to have legislative change. You may fairly ask, though, why was this issue selected rather than the many other fish welfare issues? Well, our research about these issues in the UK revealed a number of key points that helped us arrive at this specific ask rather than others. The first is that the UK government has been advised by their own Animal Welfare Committee in both 1996 and 2014 that explicit stunning requirements for fish welfare at slaughter should be set out in legislation. And the government was actually supportive of this change in 2014, but the EU wasn't. And the second point that helped us land on this specific ask was that the significant majority of the industry, as I mentioned, claims to already be stunning. So a policy change that specifically requires it in law shouldn't be prohibitively costly or encounter intense opposition. These points made the issue of stunning at slaughter a pragmatic place to start. I think as advocates, we have to recognize the challenges that we face in developing concern among the public and policymakers when it comes to fishes. So we feel that it's important to take incremental steps to seeing the change that we all want. Of course, this is still an ambitious ask that would help spare millions from terrible suffering and slaughter. And by no means is it to say that this is an easy fight or something that should be straightforward, but it's just worth highlighting that given the challenges that I mentioned, this seemed like a sensible starting point to improve fish welfare and to set a precedent for further improvements too. So the next thing I wanted to discuss then is some of the other research we did in advance of the campaign, which falls into 3 main categories: communicating the message, assessing public attitudes, and finding out the government's position. We worked with a creative agency to produce a video for our campaign highlighting the issues that fishers face at slaughter. In earlier research, we identified the public group that might be most receptive to our campaign and most willing to take action. These were conscious eaters, namely vegetarians, pescatarians, people who are concerned about ensuring that their food consumption is organic, it's local, ethical, etc., and are interested in issues like climate change. So we identified this group and we tested our campaign materials with them, and the following are a few lessons that we learned. So 1, visuals. Specific graphic imagery of how fishes are killed proves successful at getting people to take action, especially visuals related to fishes being clubbed repeatedly. However, although some of this visceral imagery performed well, anything too extreme became off-putting and made people reluctant to share it on social media. 2, comparison. Another lesson was that having an example where the law had already been improved for fishes proved very motivating. For example, Norway, where there is an explicit stunning requirement. I think this helped people to feel like there is a legitimate change that could be made here. We also learned from previous research done that comparing the treatment of fishes versus other land animals and showing people that they had a blind spot was successful in helping them to take action. And 3, existing knowledge. One of the major lessons we learned was not to assume knowledge. We had used drone shots and footage of fish farms, and some people basically didn't know what these were. And it helped us to appreciate that there are a lot of people out there who don't know much about aquaculture and fish farming at all, or necessarily that even that it exists. I think a lot of people still, their imagery of this situation is wild fishing, of a man with a fishing rod rather than huge fish farms. And so the final lesson that I wanted to mention here was about terminology. As you may have noticed, I've been using the term fishes, and this is a term that we use at the Humane League as the plural for fish, to communicate the individuality of each fish and to counter the tendency to think of them as a homogeneous mass. However, the testing that we did with public groups revealed this to be distracting for the public. So for our first campaign, we decided to be pragmatic and to use fish in our public communications for now, but hopefully to inform the public about fishes in the long run. The next area of research we conducted was commissioning a poll on people's attitudes towards fishes, both for the purposes of understanding where the public is at now, but also with the intention of hopefully acquiring information that would be useful from a lobbying perspective. We worked with YouGov, who commissioned the poll, but found that, among other interesting facts or statistics, only 8% of UK adults think that fish do not feel pain, and 71% agreed that farmed fish should have the same legal protections as other farmed animals, when it was explained to them that cows and pigs have detailed slaughter requirements, but fish don't. The final main piece of research we needed was to understand the government's position on the issue, what their level of awareness was about it, and what possible opposition they might have. We communicated with government ministries by sending a letter from our lawyers asking them to update the law to specify stunning parameters for fishes, but they responded saying that the industry was doing enough. So this helped us to understand that this was the opposition that the government would have, and that we needed to challenge this perspective in our campaign. We even included a question about this in our poll, which found that of the thousands of people surveyed, only 28% agreed that the fish farming industry can be relied upon to protect fish welfare without legal requirement. So this is an important fact that we can utilize in our engagement with the government. We decided to also use freedom of information requests to gather information, specifically regard to the inspections of fish processing sites and slaughterhouses. As I mentioned, this showed us that there were basically no welfare inspections taking place for fishes at the time of slaughter, and that the government doesn't really have any information on whether they're being stunned at all. These findings are useful for that campaign, but also helped us to affirm to us the value of the ask and that we needed to push on with it. With this information in hand and the different stages of research that I mentioned, the next step for us was about building public awareness and support for the campaign, which can be then leveraged into parliamentary support to put pressure on the government. So as I mentioned, we prepared a video highlighting the problem, and we also set up a petition. One factor of this petition that I thought was maybe interesting is that we specified a field for people to include their postcodes when they sign. So we can use the results to target specific parliamentarians if lots of people sign from their location. Now, there's a trade-off to this, and that is that additional fields make people less likely to sign a petition. But we find that parliamentarians are much more likely to be responsive if you can highlight support from their specific area. And this leads me into other 3 points that we felt could help MPs to act and could help influence government. So the first is public pressure, which can be a stick to encourage parliamentarians to act with and related to the petition that I mentioned. The second is addressing potential backlash. the calculation parliamentarians are always making is the cost-benefit comparison of action. So even if they want to support something, if they have a personal view for it, they have to consider what is the potential that it will come back to haunt them through public or industry backlash. Therefore, anything that can be done to identify potential opposition and mitigate the risk to turn that calculation in our favor is very helpful. That's why, for example, a poll showing public support is useful, and why taking opportunities, for example, any opportunity to collaborate with people who parliamentarians might think would be in opposition will greatly help. So, for example, if there are fish producers who have high welfare standards or who are already stunning, getting them involved in the campaign, if possible, is an opportunity that should be seized. The final thing that I wanted to mention in the context of communicating and influencing government is just the necessity to build trust with MPs, to convince them of the problem and solution. And this is a new challenge in the context of aquatic animal protection, because not many MPs and organizations, to be fair, have worked on this issue before. But some of the lessons from the public engagement that I outlined earlier are helpful here too. For example, comparing fishes with land farm animals who do have explicit legal protections is a powerful way to make the case that there should be explicit protection for fishes too. Now, starting up a new area of work like this with policymakers can be a slow process in the beginning. So we've decided to focus on individual meetings with parliamentarians to help develop champions for the cause, rather than pursuing any big or high-profile events at this stage. Essentially, throughout all this, what we are asking ourselves is the question: how do we make it as easy as possible for lawmakers to support our campaign, and also make it that they feel like giving their support is the only, or at least the best option for them at this point in political context? When it comes to influencing government, nimble work is crucial. We're lobbying in a rapidly changing environment in which it will be hard to always predict what will happen. Political priorities are continuously shifting, but opportunities where we can put pressure will arise. We just need to make sure that we have our eyes open to them and we can act. One important one is making use of opportunities like government consultations. For example, the Scottish government recently launched a review of aquaculture regulation. It was intimated to us and several other animal protection organizations that this review was primarily about industry rather than animal welfare, but we still took the opportunity to respond to emphasize that it should be about animal welfare and that there is need for better animal protection regulations. With all this, it's important to think strategically and not be afraid of questioning what we are doing. Our research into messaging has shown us that many challenges lie ahead to get the general public involved in such a campaign. But seeing the challenges now means that we can avoid what might not work, and means that we're in a much stronger position to take on this campaign. We hope to continue to question our strategy throughout and to be prepared to leave our comfort zone if that means enabling us to win this campaign. So the last thing I want to talk about before I finish is that it's important to mention the importance of collaboration. To ensure success, we need to continue to build both contacts and support within the political arena and within the animal welfare movement. We need to ensure that we collaborate with the wider movement so that we use our strengths to the best of our abilities and complement others. For example, I already mentioned that Animal Equality released powerful investigations on Scottish salmon. This directly fed into our work, and they were kind enough to let us use some of their footage in our campaign. There have also been good examples of groups collaborating on consultation responses. The Aquatic Life Institute, for example, helped the Humane League with our submission to an Animal Welfare Committee consultation, and we've aligned with other organizations on our responses. We also have monthly meetings of the main groups working on the topic in the UK, and we're always open to new UK-based members if there's anyone out there who wants to join. But at these meetings, we give updates, we align on plans, and discuss topics relevant to fish welfare to help our understanding of the issue and to give tips and advice. So I think that's more than enough for me, but just to kind of summarize, when we were setting out our work on fish welfare, we explored the importance of pragmatism in selecting policy goals, the need to conduct a wide range of preliminary research to understand the political context and what opportunities there are available for campaigning, how to make it as easy as possible for policymakers to support a campaign, and the importance of collaboration between animal protection organizations to achieve our goals. So I'm happy to answer questions on any of these, and thanks again for your time.
Well, thank you for that great presentation, Amro. Sounds like a very promising and well thought out campaign. I think it will have a really positive impact for fishes. So thank you for that. Now we can move on to our Q&A portion of this session. One of the things that came to mind during your presentation, Amro, I was curious about is that during our last panels, that was more of a focus on US policy. And as Kathy and Sarah were engaging with state officials, there seems to be a pretty big education gap on welfare issues for fishes. Have you run into that with MPs as well? And sort of what has been their sort of reaction to your campaign?
And thank you, Anthony. It's a really interesting question. I think we are at the start really of our kind of engagement with parliamentarians, so we'll learn a bit more about this going forward. But we do recognize that, yes, there is an education gap that we have to address. And, even simple things that we're trying to do is we've produced an infographic that just has a few key details of the scientific evidence regarding the sentience of fishes and the evidence that they feel pain, that we're just making sure that we circulate whenever we have any contact with parliamentarians. So if they have any doubts, kind of they see that. And we're aiming in any of our kind of initial engagement with parliamentarians to make sure that we kind of put that stuff up there out front. We hope to do a poll as well of parliamentarians to kind of get a more accurate understanding of what their stance is, generally in terms of similar questions to what we asked of the public, like to what percentage of people believe that fishes feel pain, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that is something that we recognize, and we are making sure that we kind of put that in front and center of our individual communications with parliamentarians.
Great, thank you. And I guess our next question, you kind of touched on this already, Amro, but so I guess this can be more for Claire, and you can add on to it if you like. But what have you seen as useful tactics in the UK for your campaigns? And what have you found that works and maybe what doesn't work?
I think we found, I shadow a lot of what Amro was just saying, actually. We have, in terms of campaign methods in the UK, when you're looking at a species that people don't know that much about, particularly when you're looking at parliamentarians, keeping things as simple as possible. So that, because it's even the words themselves, like decapod crustacean, cephalopod mollusk, they're not exactly, they don't roll off the tongue very easily. So it's something where we're trying to kind of break it down. So we try to use language when we were approaching as simple as possible, like rather than saying decapod crustaceans, we just say animals like crabs and lobsters. We try to, again, similarly to what Emma was saying, we align them with other animals that they're more familiar with. So would you want to do the same thing to a lobster as you would do, would you have that done to a rabbit, or would you have that done to a lamb? So we try to make it so that it's very recognizable with them. Again, with a lot of those things that we're talking about that happens to these animals, they're quite graphic. And they're incredibly emotive. So what we found tends to work, I mean, it's partly because the tone of our organization has always been quite measured. We've always been kind of the language that we use, we're very evidence-based, we're very kind of quite calming in that. That's just the approach we found works well for us. So we very much have found that that's been beneficial, of not kind of dramatizing things, I guess, is because what happens is awful enough and it speaks for itself. So when we try to use that, we don't use particularly graphic images. We try to use kind of, we're factual about it. So we describe things in quite a factual way. And that actually we find has quite a positive effect, because it means you don't have to make it sound worse than it is, because it is already so awful what happens to them. So again, infographics are quite useful as well in conveying some of these points. We found that kind of tends to land quite well. And oddly enough, a small dose of humor, which sounds a little kind of unusual, I guess, considering the subject matter we're often talking about. But we wanted to promote something recently, so we ended up using some costumes And we kind of did a mimic of the Abbey Road, you can kind of cross the beetles crossing the road. We had a different kind of decapod crustaceans crossing the road, and that ended up getting huge coverage, that image did, with a story that we were releasing, and ended up kind of going around the world. So having a slight dose of humor in what you're doing and knowing how to deploy it appropriately, we found has been quite successful in engaging parliamentarians as well, because even then we were outside the House of Westminster. It was tipping it down with rain. It was absolutely it was serious rain, and yet we had people coming out from their offices so they could have a photograph taken with these. They could ask us what we're involved in, saying, oh, are you the lobster people? Oh, are you here about this? And it kind of just helps, it all builds that recognition, and builds momentum, which has been so crucial for us. Certainly it's not a case where it's such an odd issue that it pops up every so often. It's making them feel like it's there all the time, that it's always something that needs to be dealt with. It's not something that can be just kind of put away to be dealt with another day.
Right. So it's kind of similar to what Amro was saying about, the importance of terminology, language, and framing. And I think that's sort of really important to highlight here. Amro, did you want to say something?
I don't think I have much to add there. I think that is, a lot of this stuff that Claire said are things that we're trying to consider and take into account as well. The ways to translate something that is quite challenging and graphic in a way that is still emotive for people, and people want to pick it up, but in a way that they can also respond and aren't immediately put off. And I think that's a balance that organizations working in this area have to try and achieve. But I think there is a way to do it.
Right. And so I guess we can move on to the next question. This one is for Claire. They want to know sort of how much public support there is and was for the campaign, and how much of a role did Brexit or other factors play into your campaign success?
So the public, ironically, seem to really engage with lobsters. It seems to be a strange thing that's happened over the last kind of 5 or 10 years anyway, in that even just things you can buy anything with a lobster on it in the UK at the moment. I don't know if it's the same globally, but there's certainly an awful lot of stuff. Lobsters crop up everywhere. So I think there's something about the animals themselves which helps, because they are slightly unusual, and they've become a bit of kind of a culture icon, which has helped us. I think also the fact that it's so extreme what happens to them. I think people for many, many years, even before the science was kind of very well known, there is something that's been very uneasy about boiling an animal alive. And I think it's never kind of quite sat well with people. They've always tried to find a way to figure out how they can do it better, whether it's thinking they're putting them in the freezer first to help, or I think it's very impactful what happens to them, which again helps. It's also quite a childhood element. So in the UK, it's quite common to go to the seaside for your holidays when you're young, and do something called crabbing, where you kind of go to rock pools and you find crabs out. So I think there's a slight nostalgia element to it as well that can come into play. So there's lots of different kind of setups that actually help to kind of create a kind of groundswell of warmth towards these slightly unusual and in some ways kind of quite bizarre creatures, in terms of how they wear the skeletons on the outside. They look very different to us. They move different to us. They're not something that people see in their everyday lives. But all of that seems to kind of build to kind of create this positive feeling towards them. So we felt, from the general public's perspective, it's been quite not easy, but it's been quite good to be able to develop all of that and bring it together and actually turn it into something where people want to act on it. So it's harnessing all of those kind of good feelings that they have and turning them into something productive. I think in terms of the Brexit element, as I mentioned in the talk, there was always a possibility, or there should always have been the option, to add decapods into the Animal Welfare Act in the UK anyway. That should have happened as is. It just hadn't, for whatever reason. So that was kind of happening anyway. Brexit gave us more opportunities because it's changed how the animal welfare kind of legislative landscape looks at the moment. So there's been a whole raft of new bills and acts coming into Parliament at the moment as a result of Brexit, because we've had, when we left the EU, we've ended up now having to kind of have some gaps that need to be filled. And we're quite, dare I say, kind of fortunate in some ways in that it has given us an opportunity to have discussions we wouldn't necessarily have had before. The important thing is to not be distracted by it, because, for example, the sentience bill, it's something we're very, very keen to get decapods added to, because they are sentient and because it's factually accurate for them to be included. but in some ways it won't actually change anything. If they got kind of included into the sentience bill, the next day nothing would change in the life of a crab. So it's kind of like the first step. So it's a really important one for us, and it's a really significant one and symbolic one, but it doesn't replace what we would already have been done. It more just kind of, it's a pathway as part of that now to actually do what we would have been doing without Brexit anyway.
Thank you for that. We have two questions. Maybe they could be combined. Let's see. So the question is, can other countries use a similar approach to the ones that you both are taking? And what advice do you have for advocates elsewhere?
I guess if I very briefly try to answer the first part of what we're finding so useful is that when we do have this report that is due to be released, which reviews all the evidence, is that actually having a government that's commissioned a report that says these animals are sentient, that is a resource that can be used by anybody. One of the things we found when we were looking at what had happened at back in 2016, we looked at the countries that currently did have some or any protection for decapods and thought, how did they get that? How did it happen? Why did it happen there? And what we found is it was really sporadic. It was for all sorts of random reasons. And the protection they had was really unusual, and it was really specific in places, and it would be really localized. And actually what would happen in the UK now is something that will hopefully be replicable, because other countries and other organizations can look and say, here is this report that led the UK government to making this decision. And that's something that will hopefully be able to be used regardless of where you are in the world, because it's looking at the science and the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, for our side, seeing that there was, another country where there had been this legislative change to require explicit stunning for fishes is a useful tool for us to use in the UK when engaging parliamentarians. And I think, as Claire mentioned, there is a lot that can capitalize on from different countries. In terms of general lessons and advice for elsewhere, I think, although a lot of the political contextual issues are specific, country specific, I think there are broad lessons, that can be utilized in lots of different contexts for, in terms of conducting the research required to ascertain where the specific opportunities are in terms of determining the policy it asks, but also just in terms of how you engage with the public and parliamentarians, and the ways to build coalitions and to build people on side. There of course will be cultural points to that are context specific, but I think there are broad lessons that can be utilized. And I would just kind of encourage people to attend events like this and engage with people internationally to kind of learn from what's worked in other places. Because I think, even my experience of listening to other people speak about work going on in different countries at this conference and elsewhere helps even me to think about what can be translated to the British context. So I think there is a lot of room for exchange.
I would absolutely second that as well. I think the collaboration that it's taken has been crucial for all the work that we've done. Has been working with all the different animal welfare organisations and scientists and across spectrum. It's not just within the animal welfare world, it's looking more externally as well at what other expertise you need, and just finding those people and contacting them and kind of building that network up. And that's been very, very crucial to our success too. And we're very thankful for all the help and assistance we've had along the way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been learning a lot at this conference too as well. So it's been a great learning experience for me. But I think we'll leave it at that. A big thank you to our two wonderful panelists, and thank you to all our attendees for joining us for this session. Please keep your eye out for post-conference communications on ways you can continue to be involved in protecting aquatic animals. Also, feel free to follow us on social media and visit ali.fish for more information. As this event ends, we will take a 15-minute break. So feel free to take a quick rest and join us for our next panel in 15 minutes, where Catalina Lopez, who is the director of ALI's Aquatic Animal Alliance, will be discussing the importance of engaging with global certifiers for aquatic animal welfare and our certifier campaign. So enjoy your short break, everyone, and we'll see you at our next session shortly. Thank you.